So I'm going to go ahead and just get started here. I want to talk about the midterm elections and talk about the race that's happening in Georgia. But first, I'd like to get a little bit of reflection from both of you, if you don't mind. Leader Cantor, we did not see the Republican red wave emerge. Democrats are still holding on to control of the Senate, but Republicans did secure power in the House, and they were able to flip some key seats. So can you tell us what some of the lessons learned for your party is out of the midterm elections, and whether or not there might be a ceiling on the amount of support for some of the MAGA policies and questions about the 2020 election?
Well, I think, Ylan, first of all, it's good to be with you, and with Heidi. I can't see her, but nice to be with you as well. I think first you sort of take a step back and you try and at least be somewhat reticent about drawing too much broad-based conclusion about any one election or any one cycle. I will say I was taken aback about the inability for my party to gain more seats. I think I, like most people, were thinking this was a classic referendum election. The economy is not doing well. The inflation is sky high. The president is not popular. All those things should have resulted in my party gaining more seats. But I think in the end, some more structural issues came into play, and one of which was the fact that the sort of House seat map, if you will, was pretty much picked over. I mean, the low-hanging fruit, my party had gained a lot of those seats in 2020 and came within five seats of majority leading into 2022 election. And I just remember back to when my party recaptured the majority in 2010 when I became leader, we picked up 63 seats. But then again, we were down at 178, and you need 218 to make majority. So again, I think that because of that issue, that this election didn't see a larger pickup. And I think, secondly, we're a closely divided country politically, and I think this sort of played out in this election. And there's no question that on issues of policy, this country is very divided. And then I'd say, lastly, to your point about MAGA candidates or what have you, I do think candidates matter, and we certainly saw that in the Senate. And I know Heidi closer to that in her service in Washington, but I do think that did have something to do with the fact that my party was unable to capture the majority in the Senate.
Senator Heitkamp, what do you think worked in Democrats' favor, and how should they interpret the results as they look toward control of the Senate in 2023 and the next session of Congress and beyond, and how they work with Republicans in the House?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I agree with Eric that when you look at a two-cycle election cycle, the low-hanging fruit was picked off in 2020. You would expect when your person wins the presidency that you would gain a significant number of seats. In fact, that was the anticipation in 2020, and it didn't happen. And so I think a lot of people were over-predicting what the swing would look like. But they also did not predict the reversal of Roe v. Wade by the Dobbs decision. That played a huge factor in terms of enthusiasm on the Democratic side and among independent women in particular. And so they went to the ballot box. You couple that with some very, very challenged candidates on the Republican side, candidates that were picked by the former president, who really had a message of grievance as opposed to what they were going to do for the economy. And so I think this was a missed opportunity by the Republicans. Now, switching this over, I know there's a lot of people who say, oh, this means it's an affirmation of the Democratic agenda. I would say go back and take a look at the polls. Take a look at the favorability ratings, whether people think the country is headed in the right direction, the wrong direction. The Democratic administration is still challenged on those numbers. Joe Biden's not particularly popular. And the one that I always watch is the Index of Consumer Sentiment from the University of Michigan. Very low marks for the economy. And so where this election was about things that were broader, democracy, it was about abortion rights, it was about the chaos of the MAGA candidate, I think you cannot understate that there still is an incredible dissatisfaction with the economy right now, and that could, if it's ignored, come back to haunt the Democratic Party in 2024. And so divided government, now the Democrats are perceived by the public to be in charge. If things don't improve in the economy in the next 2 years, I think there will be retribution in the polls in 2024, depending upon your candidates.
Sure, and I want to talk about those economic policies in just a little bit, but the elections also are not over. We talk about how closely divided the country is, and that's playing out right now in Georgia. Right now we're having today, people in Georgia are voting for the Senate seat. Incumbent Democratic candidate Raphael Warnock is running against the GOP challenger, Herschel Walker, a former football star. The reason we're having this runoff is because neither of the candidates was able to get 50% of the vote on election day. And so now voters are going back to the full polls where they can face off against each other once more. Leader Cantor, does this race matter if we already know that Democrats are going to be in control of the Senate? What's important to watch here?
Sure. Every race matters for sure. And I know for the people of Georgia, it matters a lot. If you look at the obvious right now, as you said before, the control of the Senate is decided with 50-50 if my party were to win today, still tie break by Vice President Harris. So the Democrats will control. But the difference that this race could make would be, number one, the makeup of committees in the Senate. And I know Heidi lived this, and certainly we in the House live by this rule as well. When you have a majority, and you really have a majority, not just even, you have control of every committee. And so that means you set the agenda. That means you can seek and have subpoena power without the okay of the other party. You have the ability to affect your nominations in the Senate. So this has a lot to do with control and the ability to get whatever it is they're going to be able to get done for President Biden in the Senate. So I do think it matters. And I think looking to 2024, Democratic Party is going to have a very tough map. I know Heidi knows this, and my party will be advantaged in a big way because I think there are at least 3 Democratic incumbent senators that will be in red states that Trump won by handy margins. So that would help them if they were to win today. Now, we'll see what happens when the polls close. Yeah.
So, Senator Heitkamp, how would life be different for Democrats if they're able to hold on to the seat in Georgia?
Well, for your particular audience, I want them to imagine that right now in the Banking Committee, whether you have a hearing on something has to be really done by consensus. If the Democrats get control, they can make a lot more impact in those committees in terms of not just the vote and getting bills out of committee, but also in what is being considered by the chairman. And so this really does matter, and it does matter, as Leader Cantor talked about, it does matter when you look to the 2024 cycle. Now, I will remind people that Joe Manchin and my friend John Tester and Sherrod Brown all won in a very difficult cycle, a cycle that Claire McCaskill, Joe Donnelly, and I were not able to be successful in. And so don't count them out, even though they're in that 2024 cycle. I think it's going to depend on who presents the best vision for the country. But that's going to be done by committee hearings. It's going to be done by legislative agenda. And I think it's going to be defined not only by the administration, but by a Senate majority, because I fully expect that Herschel Walker will not be successful in Georgia this evening.
So let's turn to what some of the party priorities might be in the new Congress. Senator Heitkamp, you talked a lot about how Democrats might have to face the consequences of an economic downturn, if that's indeed what happens next year. What do you see Democrats pursuing in the new session of Congress?
I think what they're going to be talking about is, as my friend Barbara Mikulski used to say, yes, we've got to deal with the macro issues, but you've got to deal with the macaroni and cheese issues. And you saw some of that at the end of the last Congress when they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which included some containment and controls on drug pricing. I think that there's going to be a debate about the continuation of tax benefits for the middle and low income, whether that is the child care tax credit, which they're going to be debating now before this Congress ends, but I think that debate continues. And so I think the Democrats are going to be looking for those things in public policy that really address the concerns of working families and making sure that those working families understand what they are doing to, number one, lower their costs, improve their economic opportunity, and to make sure that their family can move forward. And that's got to include, by the way, I was fascinated by the previous discussion about investment. We know that we have a huge investment gap. A lot of people are not prepared to retire. That's got to be something that's on the Democratic agenda, because it creates huge insecurity in American families when they think, I'm going to have to work until I'm 80 in order to put food on the table. And so these are all issues that I expect we're going to see. But remember, the macaroni and cheese issues are the ones the Democrats are really going to advance.
Leader Cantor, can Republicans work with Democrats on making macaroni and cheese?
Well, Ylan, let me sort of level set and have a reality check on what I think will be accomplished, macaroni and cheese or otherwise. The reality is we are in a divided, we're going to a divided country, but we're witnessing a divided government in Washington. And so I think the expectations of what can actually get done, where that quote unquote common ground is going to be very limited. First, I do think that that which has to get done will ultimately get done, and not without struggle. I think you're going to have some budget showdowns, meaning potential government shutdowns, and obviously for the audience here in terms of their clients and what the outlook is and what they can expect. I mean, there could be some volatility in the markets, not just from a government shutdown, because unfortunately that's become yet not such a dramatic event over time, but it is that debt ceiling which can bring about a real concern in terms of market players. So I do think we can anticipate that in the next Congress. And then for anything else beyond which those two things will get done, I think it's sort of the non-headline grabbing issues. And financial services in particular could be that. I mean, I remember back when we were in the House majority during the Obama administration and the only Republican force, if you will, in Washington, we were able to get something done called the Jobs Act, and it was very helpful to small businesses to access the capital markets. And it was one of those issues where you're not going to grab a lot of headlines with it, but it actually did make a big impact on small and emerging growth companies in the markets. And I think those kinds of things, there is discussion about crypto, or for instance, in the House Financial Services Committee, there is already work being done by the incoming chairman, Patrick McHenry, and now the ranking member, Maxine Waters, around stable coins, around the crypto arena writ large. So perhaps that could see some bipartisan support. And I think from that point, again, it is about the Republican Aggies, if you will, who want to join with the Democrats to get a farm bill done. Those are the kinds of things that may get done, but again, no headline-grabbing offense. I think you're not going to see much of that this upcoming Congress.
Now, there is bipartisan support for retirement legislation that could move even during the lame duck session. There's something called the Secure Act, which would allow withdrawals from your 401k in the event of emergency. It would increase the mandatory age of distribution. Do you guys anticipate this actually moving? If not this Congress, maybe next Congress?
I think when something is bipartisan, and retirement security is something that both sides, I think, recognizes. We can't have a society that's completely dependent on Social Security now that we're seeing home ownership actually being challenged. You know, the three legs of retirement stool was, your home ownership, your retirement plan, and your Social Security. And the retirement plans are undervalued in that structure right now because we don't have the savings rates that we need to. And I think anything that we can do to encourage that is absolutely critical, and it's bipartisan. I want to add just one point because we haven't talked about it yet. I think it's going to be very difficult for the eventual speaker, who I think will be Kevin McCarthy, to actually corral a group of people to advance some of these ideas when there is so much structural difference in his caucus, and I think Eric understands this, having been lived through that for a number of months, how difficult it's going to be to lead the House majority in this context. And so there will be this pull between actually getting something done and making political points. And, you know, which direction he leads his caucus in will depend on how much gets done.
So, Leader Cantor, you brought this up just a moment ago, but the issue of the debt ceiling, do you think, I mean, how worried are you that that is not going to get raised? I mean, you lived through some of these battles before, or do you see this as political posturing during a sort of early phase of Congress?
So again, I don't think that they're going to see any kind of debt ceiling get done in the lame duck in Congress, and I think we're more likely looking at a period of some uncertainty, volatility around that issue, probably in Q3 of 23. Is when Treasury has given some indication that that will be the time at which the federal government has to have increased statutory authority to go to the debt markets. So yes, I think there'll be a lot of drama. I think ultimately it will be raised. It'll be really rough sledding. Again, I think the incoming majority from my party will have a margin of 5 votes, just like Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats had this last Congress. So at any point in time, you can have a small group of members arise in a coalition to block and then to ask for something. And so I do think, again, Joe Biden has been through this before when, you know, my party was in the majority, and I worked with him over the years to try and find some common ground that we could see that these issues did not become stumbling blocks. But I'm reticent to say that maybe the administration is going to be so willing to negotiate with the Republicans. And I think that it'll be more like this is a sacrosanct issue. We need to raise the debt ceiling, and it'll be a real. There'll be a lot of drama. I think ultimately it gets done, but very difficult.
We do have a couple of questions from the audience that I want to make sure to get in. Senator Heitkamp, this one I'm gonna toss it to you. The question is there any likelihood of cannabis legislation in the lame duck or after? Now, I know that there is some push to include some measures on the annual defense bill in the lame duck that would allow cannabis businesses to have easier access to the banking system. That's being pushed by both Democrats and some Republicans. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, what we're doing right now is extremely dangerous because we've taken this industry and turned it into a cash industry by not making it part of the legitimate banking structure. And so I'm hopeful that this will come kind of nearer to the front of the line than what people suspect, just because the danger of not doing it will be continuing to overlook the danger of this being a cash-based industry. On the debt limit, I do want to make this point, is that, you know what, the gift that Nancy Pelosi and the lame duck Congress could give is a permanent restructuring of how we determine the debt limit so we don't have to confront this. And right now, if I'm Kevin McCarthy, I go to Nancy Pelosi and say, you just need to make this raising the debt limit a permanent thing, not a piece by piece. Anytime we get to this structural difference where we need to raise the debt limit, just say if we've spent the money, we need to pay the bills.
Got it. And Leader Cantor, here's another question for you from the audience. The question is, have you changed any of your investment decisions based on the outcome of the midterm elections? Any changes to the portfolio?
Well, listen, just
personal
talking
or for
personally,
your firm?
right? Personally, not personally. You know, Moelis and Company, we're an investment bank, but an advisor, so we don't actually have principal investment activities at our firm. So I can't speak for the firm. Personally, I think my wife and I have always endeavored to be participants in the markets and to take a longer-term view. I don't think there is going to be anything that is a huge spending package or a huge tax package the way we saw in the last Congress, and so I think that's a positive. It's one of the things that actually results from having divided government and my party in control of the House, that all that large spending that occurred along with increased taxes won't happen now. So For that reason, I think it is much more likely that the Fed activities and the monetary policy is going to be that much more impactful to the equities markets in particular. So again, we take, from a personal household standpoint, a much more long-term view and believe that still putting our capital to work here in America is a good thing and will have long-term positive results.
Great, and I'd like to end here with a final question that maybe will take a 30,000-foot look, because there's been a lot of debate in Washington and amongst the parties really about the relationship between Washington and the business community. Leader Cantor, we've heard a lot from Republicans who say they want to try to hold businesses accountable for their policies regarding climate and social activities. What's your advice on how to navigate that? How should folks be thinking about that and the relationship between Washington and business?
Well, first of all, if you take that 30,000-foot view, this populism, which is what this is about now infecting my party, it started with the Democrats. It started with the Justice Democrats and the real progressives like Bernie Sanders and others, really going back to the Occupy Wall Street sort of mantra from Barack Obama. And what we've seen is that has grown now to my side of the aisle, and you've seen some real resistance on the part of Republicans to the corporate moves towards what is deemed woke capitalism. And again, I think that we're going to go through a period of this. I don't think there's a necessary answer, but my advice would be to companies, businesses, if you can focus on what's important to your business and make sure that you're addressing that in the public square in any kind of advocacy. And if there's any input or pressure that is coming to bear on the part of your shareholders or your employees, vendors, et cetera, we've got a free country. And as long as businesses are giving their employee base the opportunity to have free expression as individuals, but not in the name of the business, I think you'll be much better put when it comes to some of these legislative and policy battles. I mean, just witness what's going on in Florida and with Disney in particular. I think that's where a strategy went awry, and the business actually suffered from somewhat of a overreach in terms of the business's advocacy versus allowing employees to advocate.
Senator Heitkamp, your thoughts?
Well, I think had the Senate gone Republican, I think Ted Cruz and the folks who want to make this a signature issue would have had hearings. There would have been a lot more legislation. There would have been a lot more directed action on ESGs. And so when you look forward, the question is, what is the future of American capitalism? And I think a lot of corporate, I spent last evening celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Business Roundtable. I've spent a lot of time visiting with people like Jamie Dimon, who completely understand that it is in businesses' best interest to treat their employees well, to basically have diverse governance, to look at what are their social factors, what are their environmental factors, because that's what their investors want. Now, this is a classic example of how investors have changed over time. That fiduciary safe harbor of only looking at a profit loss kind of margin is not the investor interest of the future. And so just as I think the Republican Party has ignored some of the young voters' issues, and they've suffered the consequences of that in this last election, they have to be responsive to some of the new investors' issues as it relates to some of these other factors and how they want corporate America to respond and be part of the dialogue on what needs to happen in America. But I expect that that's going to be an argument in the boardroom. It's going to be an argument in the committee rooms. It's going to be an argument in the public space. What is the role of corporate America as we move forward as a country in producing a great economy, but also an economy that's inclusive?